Alice Madden. I'm the Executive Director of the Getch's Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment. Welcome to Colorado Law. We're really happy that you are here. We have a really amazing event tonight. Professor Mary Wood is going to be speaking and presenting the 2017 Distinguished Lecture. Just a couple of things before we start, and I introduce Charles Wilkinson. We're going to have a reception afterwards, so after the lecture, our conversation can continue. It's in the room right over there. And while we're at the reception and afterwards, if you notice someone with a name tag with a brown dot on it, that means they're a student. So I'm sure they'd love to hear from our members of community and other subject experts who are here. So introduce yourself to our students. And This is why we're here, of course, is to educate future generations who will solve the problems that we're leaving them with. So it's my pleasure to introduce Charles Wilkinson, who's going to be introducing Professor Mary Wood. Charles is really one of our most renowned professors at the law school. He's one of my favorite people on the planet. I could go on, but we only have an hour, so I think I'm going to cut it short. But Charles is the Moses Lasky Professor of Law and Distinguished University Professor here at University of Colorado, and I'm just going to hand things over to him for the evening. Charles Wilkinson.
Good evening. Thanks everybody for coming out for this occasion. Every year we at the Getch's Wilkinson Center invite a leading person in the field of natural resources, law, and policy to be our distinguished lecturer. This is the fourth year of this annual program. Secretary Bruce Babbitt was our first distinguished lecturer. Mike Connor, Deputy Secretary of Interior, was our second. And Bill Hedden, the Executive Director of the Grand Canyon Trust, was our visiting lecturer last year. But tonight, we are proud to welcome Professor Mary Wood, who's the Philip H. Knight Professor of Law at the University of Oregon. Mary is an outstanding teacher, a leading scholar in both natural resources law and Indian law, and one of the West's most creative public intellectuals. She has co-authored case books on natural resources law and the law of the public trust doctrine. She is a favorite of Oregon law students for generations, or for decades now, and has been awarded the Ersted Award for Distinguished Teaching, labeling the outstanding teacher on the entire University of Oregon campus. In the early 1990s, there had been little influential writing on the federal trust relationship to Indian tribes. There had been some good work done in the 70s, but there had been about a 20-year gap. Mary did a series of 3 articles that have become standard references in the field, the best sources really on the trust relationship. Her work on the public trust doctrine is stunning. She's written many articles, lectured widely, and in 2013 published the well-regarded book with Cambridge University Press, Nature's Trust, Environmental Law for a New Ecological Era. Nature's Trust is in the front line of scholarship on natural resources, law, policy, and philosophy. Tonight you will hear from her on the extraordinary campaign that she conceived and developed, the atmospheric trust litigation, in which young people play such a critical role. I would like to report a short version of a long, long story that will give you some sense of the depth of her passion for and connection to the land and Indian people, especially in her beloved Pacific Northwest. As of 1887, a young military officer, highly regarded, C.E.S. Wood, was assigned to the Wallowa Valley in Oregon. The Wallowa Valley was the homeland of Chief Joseph and many relatives and clan members. Put it on your list to go to. There are few places, even in the West, as majestic and sublime as the Wallowa Valley. Our people wanted that land. And with no legal, moral, or public policy excuse other than that Americans had to settle the West, they wanted to open the Wallowa Valley for homesteading. And it worked. Chief Joseph and his family and colleagues resisted, but finally their time had come, and they were forcibly removed. C.E.S. Wood, was in the military force that was going to escort Chief Joseph to a new reservation. Along the way, they were raided, and finally, they broke loose and decided to head to new country. And they began one of the most fabled retreats in American history. Chief Joseph was a brilliant military mind, and I'm not sure if it's still true, but as of a generation ago, some of his tactics were still being studied in our military schools. The march took 1,300 miles, and finally they realized that maybe they could make it to Canada, but they came up about 40 miles short. And on a plain just below the Bear Paw Mountains. And there, Chief Joseph gave in and gave his famous speech, "I will fight no more forever." CES loved Chief Joseph. They got to know each other. They knew each other back in the Wallowa Valley, and during the long trek when they were not together, they both thought of each other much. And on that plain beneath the Bear Paws, they exchanged saddles. CES had had enough of the military. He was horrified by what he and his colleagues had done, went to law school with the idea of finding a way to get Chief Joseph's land in the Wallowa back. That never happened in spite of his earnest work. He was an able and accomplished lawyer. When CES's son, Erskine, now Mary's grandfather, because CES was her great-grandfather, CES asked Joseph if Erskine, then 14, could spend time with him. And for 2 summers, Erskine went out and lived with Chief Joseph in his tent for the summer, and they became very close friends. And of course, it was something that he remembered all of his life. I want to say that Erskine lived to be 104, and Mary knew him well. CES wanted to repay Chief Joseph or give him a gift for having his son there. And he asked Erskine to inquire of Chief Joseph of what kind of gift he might like. And Chief Joseph said that he would like a stallion for his ponies. He kept many. Erskine thought that that seemed too little. He had thought Chief Joseph might ask that Erskine ask CES to continue getting his land back and getting it back. And so Erskine, although of course Chief Joseph would have delighted in that gift, never told his father about what Chief Joseph wanted. Of course, Erskine kept that within him and kept it within the family. And in the early 1990s, the family, Mary being right up front, decided that they ought to do something to give that gift to Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph had no direct descendants. They had been killed in the march. His children had been. But he had siblings, and so there were relatives. And they, Mary, doing a lot of the work, talked around and found out who would be the best person to be, and it was the person who was the traditional leader of the Joseph Band, now at the Colville Reservation in Washington. And they raised $22,000 to purchase a majestic stallion and presented it to Chief Joseph's heir. And today, Mary's family has always had a cabin on the Columbia. And the tribe comes in, the Nez Perce tribe comes in for a ceremony, and they always do a welcoming dinner when they come down. And that's who will be presenting to you tonight.
You outdid yourself. Oh, well, I'm not sure I can outdo that. That really gives me chills, wonderful chills, to hear the story as told by one of my great heroes, Charles Wilkinson. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here in Boulder. First of all, can you hear me? I come from Oregon, where there's dense smoke from fires, and so it's taken a toll on my voice. Can you hear me all right? It is absolutely wonderful to be here in Boulder, which I think of as a place sort of as a hub of climate action, with its young climate warriors, its visionary renewable energy experts, and its dedicated league of citizens who are absolutely determined to create a safe future. And it is a supreme honor to give the lecture that is named after the two legal giants that have so shaped Indian law, natural resources law, and public lands law with their brilliant vision and dedication to justice, Charles Wilkinson and David Getches. And my honor is very much magnified by the immense gratitude I have to Charles for being an absolutely invaluable mentor and guiding light since the first year of my teaching career. He is the person who, in an unparalleled way, steps back from the law as it appears in the moment to the rest of us, and he contextualizes it in history, recognizing and identifying its organizing force through the ages. And he is the one who captures the essence of legal principles and their driving rationale and inspires the rest of us to all reach towards this law, no matter how daunting the challenge we may face. And it was really largely Charles's scholarship that led me to the heart of the public trust doctrine many years ago. So this evening, I will describe a legal campaign and strategy that draws upon the public trust principle to confront the climate emergency. Let us begin with a simple recognition that we are the living beneficiaries of a public trust, a priceless trust. This trust holds the waters, the air, the wildlife, the forests, the soils, and all that encompasses the web of life. Our ancestors drew their life from this trust, and our descendants must do so as well. This trust, this exquisitely balanced, spectacularly complex, and absolutely vital earth endowment supports all life systems. And without it functioning, life does not persist. That is law. That is nature's law. And we would be fools not to recognize such law as the supreme law of the land, or even to doubt for a moment that the jurisdiction over our very survival falls first to the air, the waters, the food sources, and the climate system. All of our ancestors recognized these truths. And so it should come as no surprise that one of the most basic and original understandings of any government formed by the people concerns the people's rights in this essential ecology, rights that are expressed in the ancient public trust principle, which dates back to Roman times and has been part of our nation's jurisprudence since the very beginning. This principle speaks to the origin of government itself. As part of the social compact between the people and their government, the people, we the people, hold back for ourselves the inalienable property rights to crucial public resources. And this principle was underscored in a legal opinion rendered in 2013 by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And that court overturned a statute that had permitted fracking. And that was a practice that fouled much and still fouls much of Pennsylvania and fouls much of Colorado. Chief Justice Castile wrote a plurality opinion in that case declaring that the citizens have rights to essential ecology, that these rights are inherent and indefeasible and inviolate. And as he explained, these rights are secured rather than bestowed by the Constitution. So they amount to basic rights that we, the people, have always held and still hold. Well, a legal right held by citizens gives rise to the duty on the part of the government to protect that right. And since the beginning of this nation, courts have declared that the government is a trustee of crucial ecology that we all depend on. A trust is a concept in property law, which means basically that certain assets are managed by one party for the benefit of another. And so the beneficiaries of this public trust are the people, both present but also future generations of citizens. And the public trust sets a limit on the resources that government can allow profiteers to exploit. Well, in 1872, in this case, Illinois Central Railroad, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a foundational matter. It confronted a situation that had never occurred before. There, the Illinois legislature had conveyed the entire shoreline of Lake Michigan in Chicago to a private railroad company. Can you imagine this? The entire shoreline of Chicago. Well, this was shoreline that the citizens needed for fishing and navigation and commerce. It was essential. And so the United States Supreme Court said, you can't do that, state legislature. A grant of such crucial resources to a corporation would actually be a grievance, which could never be long borne by a free people. And it held that conveyance absolutely invalid. Well, when you understand that the ecology of nature's trust supports our very survival, no less so for our children and future generations than for us, you can see that this public trust principle aims for the endurance rather than the expiration of our nation. It prevents our political leaders from abusing their breathtaking authority over natural resources to serve their own political interests at our expense. This principle comes twin-born with democracy. This trust is so basic that is found in states throughout this country and in many nations throughout the world. And as Charles himself famously wrote years ago, the real headwaters of the public trust doctrine arise in rivulets from all reaches of the basin that holds the societies of the world. This principle is, as Gerald Torres writes, the law's DNA. Well, since the beginning of this nation, the trust principle has been enforced by the courts, the third branch of government. They have played a unique constitutional role in protecting the vital ecology of this nation, for, as Charles noted, the public trust doctrine is rooted in the precept that some resources are so central to the well-being of the community that they must be protected by distinctive, judge-made principles. So now you see what I mean when I say that Charles steps back from the law and derives the essence of the principle through his words. Well, this public trust doctrine is now just as important to our survival as it was to the survival of those in 1892, because we sit at an absolutely extraordinary moment in time in human history, at the edge of tipping points that I will explain in a few minutes. And we have absolutely no choice but to match the law with the reality that we face. The reality is quite honestly terrifying as we find our society racing towards what scientists describe as an uninhabitable planet. As we sit here this evening together, we can feel ourselves drawn in irrevocably into an unprecedented era of disruption as communities struggle to recover from Hurricane Harvey, which put Houston under 10 feet of water. That hurricane, of course, was followed by Irma, the most powerful hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic. And now there are other hurricanes stacking up behind that, making destructive landfall. Jeff Goodall captures the moment by saying, we're living in a new world now, and we better get ready. Mother Nature's coming after us. And in many ways, we've created this world. So let me first describe the climate crisis that we're facing, and then I'll explain how youth across this country are asking courts to enforce public trust and constitutional rights to a stable climate system. But I pause here to note that I never want to give the impression to any one of you that law is a panacea. It's not. If you're an engineer, don't wait for the law. Any engineers in here? Just get up and leave the room right now and develop a battery to save this world. But you must understand that I'm only a lawyer. And so what I have to talk about tonight is the law. That's my toolkit. But engineers and teachers and poets, they're all vastly important and all must devote their unique talents to this crisis. Before we look at the climate crisis, let's just put at the forefront of our minds the basic purpose of law. It's basically to organize society to prevent harm to all of us. Justice Holmes famously said that common law was the felt necessities of the times. Well, the remedies we seek from the law for this crisis, however daunting it is, must fit the harm. It can't be too small or it won't work. And so atmospheric trust litigation was conceived around that notion. So how bad are things? Well, if you are sleeping well at night, if anybody in this room is sleeping well at night, you probably don't know enough about climate science. I will refer you to an article that came out in the New Yorker, the July 10th New Yorker. It's now annotated because it proved to be such a controversial article. It's called the Doomsday Article. It pretty much can be summarized by this statement by the author. It is, I promise, worse than you think. No matter how well informed you are surely not alarmed enough. And I think that's true. So let's go into the nature of this crisis. At the very center of this crisis, the good news is, it's just pollution. Well, it's not just pollution. Actually, it's animal agriculture too. There's feedlots. These things, there's other causes. There's deforestation. There's a few things that are huge causes that I'm not going to talk about tonight. I'm going to focus on fossil fuel pollution tonight because those other causes would take up even more time than I have. but they are worthy and certainly are incorporated into the big case I'll talk about tonight. In any event, I'm going to talk about pollution. The law, environmental law, has dealt with pollution before. It has the tools. It's had them for 40 years. We emit, as a world, 70 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per day. This lingers in the atmosphere over 1,000 years, some of it. And that means that there is heating in the pipeline. So no matter how bad things are, if we were to stop our emissions tomorrow, all of them, we still are in for a big dose of heating that we can't call back. So every single time you drive, think of that. It's going to stay in the atmosphere. Because of the greenhouse effect that you're all familiar with, I'm sure, the Earth, the planet, is heating. This is causing the ice masses around the Earth to melt. Greenland is breaking up. The West Antarctic ice sheet is disintegrating. And scientists believe it's beyond the point of no return. In fact, just this summer, a chunk the size of Delaware broke off suddenly, alarming the scientists even more than they had been. This is causing sea level rise that is drowning communities, causing Alaska communities to flee and relocate. The sea level rise on the East Coast and in Florida is now a routine matter, causing these kinds of high tide floods. Soon these areas will not be habitable. By the end of the century, there will be at least 6 feet more of sea level rise. The oceans are dying. The oceans are dying. And this is because they have absorbed so much of our carbon dioxide pollution that this has heated the oceans, and it has also made them 30% more acidic than before the Industrial Revolution. And so now baby shellfish in areas can't survive. There's an oyster farm, many oyster farms in Oregon on the coast. They raise baby oysters. Those baby oysters can't survive on their own because the water erodes their shells just as soon as they make them. That's a problem. That's a big problem if our oceans are dying. We're getting incredible storms like Superstorm Sandy and the hurricanes we saw. These storms are made worse by the amount of precipitation in the atmosphere and the energy in the system. These are city leveling storms. There's epic flooding, places like Arizona and California, and spread of disease and new diseases like the Zika virus. There are killer heat waves that will become common in areas. And if you want to, well, you should read that Doomsday Article, but do read the part, do not skip the part about heat death, because we're on a trajectory that literally the human body can't deal with. And he's pretty graphic, the author is. He said, you know, under the heating that we're going straight towards, the human body in the tropics is going to cook inside and out. There's water shortages. The UN predicts 1/3 of the globe will be facing water shortages because of climate distress. California had barely enough water in 2014 to meet its needs. And years ago, several years ago, the then Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, told the media this. I think this is just the most incredible quote. So read it with me. He said, "I don't think the American public has gripped in its gut what could happen. We're looking at a scenario where there's no more agriculture in California. I don't actually see how they can keep their cities going either." The wildfire is taking over Oregon and parts of the West. I know Colorado has experienced this. It's devastating. I put this picture up to show you a subdivision. This is, the suburban dream is right here before you. These people, thousands of people in subdivisions in California, were sort of living out the suburban life one day. And in the night, they were running for their lives from a wildfire. And this is the result of it. So these kinds of things are exacerbated and fueled by climate heating. This is my area, the iconic Columbia Gorge. This is the two worlds, the beautiful, priceless one, and then the one that is coming over us, becoming terrifying, that has affected my voice so that I have trouble speaking without some hoarseness in front of you tonight. The climate crisis is driving species into extinction. The UN predicts that 1/3 of all species will be threatened by extinction. It's causing refugees all around the world, and in fact in this country alone too. Climate is seen as an immediate military threat by U.S. military leaders. It is also known as a threat multiplier. It multiplies other threats that may be present within countries. Are you ready for the bottom line? The bottom line is if we do things tomorrow like we did today, we're just still on that business as usual track. The scientists call it BAU. There's an acronym for it, business as usual. And it's heading us towards 9 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit warming over most of this country by 2090. Now, everything I've described is just a couple degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists show this in the future, before the end of the century. And there's not one climate scientist I've found that says that this is survivable. So that is really the bottom line. There's not one climate scientist that can say this is survivable. So Jim Hansen, the former chief climate scientist of this country, puts it this way: global warming threatens not simply the Earth, but the fate of all its species, including humanity. Gus Speth, who I think Charles must know, and I know, who is the former dean of Yale School of Forestry and is a law professor at Vermont, wrote a book, Bridge at the Edge of the World, and he said this: if we keep doing exactly what we are doing today, the world in the latter part of this century won't be fit to live in. He's talking about 2050. So now I pause to ask you to do some arithmetic. If there is anybody you love, anyone you can think of you love or even have some affection for, under 30 years old, maybe it's your child, maybe it's your nephew or niece, maybe it's your young cousin, maybe it's just a neighbor. Just do a little bit of calculation right now. How old will they be in 2050? My son, 11 years old, will be 44 years old. He'll be younger than me. And here is a very esteemed colleague who has summarized books and books of what he calls collapse literature. And he and so many others I could put up on the screen but spare you tonight are saying this world won't be livable by mid-century or maybe beyond. So if that weren't bad enough, and we'll get to what the law can do, but we have to face reality first. If that weren't bad enough, we face tipping points. And in my conversations with many people, they don't understand the tipping points. They think we're 20 years back and we have 20 years to go. But we're at a planetary tipping point that scientists around the world have identified. And what this means is there's a point at which nature's own processes kick in and they create feedback loops that we can't get out of. These are feedback loops that are much more powerful than anything we could do or not do. And so what are these feedback loops? They lead us right into runaway heating. If we go beyond the tipping point and we trigger these, we go into runaway heating. So I'll just name a couple. There's quite a few, actually, but I'll just name a couple. One is the forests. The forests are supposed to absorb carbon dioxide, and they've done a really good job in the past. But because we've heated our world, the forests are heating and dying, and they're succumbing to fire. Well, once they succumb to fire, they release carbon dioxide, and they're not there to absorb it. So that's the feedback. Another is the permafrost that is across all the northern latitudes. This permafrost contains methane and carbon dioxide, huge amounts, more than we could ever produce on our own. And that is starting to melt. You can see the melt in the picture above. If this really started going, this would be like an atmospheric tsunami. It would make our carbon emissions look minute. And so the point of all this is that there's a time frame we have to gear up for in the law. Because if we don't act soon enough, as climate scientists say, we will eliminate the option of preserving a habitable climate system. So let's take a pause. We've talked about the climate crisis. It's pretty bad, isn't it? It affects survival. It affects everybody on Earth. There's not one corner of the planet that I know that's safe from it. Even though different areas will get different things, there's not one corner of the planet safe from it, and it's urgent. So now, let's turn to the law. Well, what's the law anyway? Well, the law that I turn to first and foremost is the law that tribal elders speak of. It's natural law, as they speak of it. And Oren Lyons says it this way: the thing you have to understand about nature and natural law is there's no mercy. There's only law. So in other words, there's nature's laws that we must abide by. But that's not the system of law that we've created. We've created a system of statutes, and what that has done has actually brought about this crisis. Elizabeth Colbert says, it may seem impossible to believe that a technologically advanced society could choose to destroy itself, but that is what we're now in the process of doing. Well, let me make clear, it's not that we don't have enough law. We have plenty of law, let me assure you, plenty, and plenty of regulations and plenty of agencies implementing the law. The problem is this law has permitted the very destruction it was designed to prevent. It has been geared towards permitting pollution and permitting a fossil fuel system that develops and drills and mines and exports fossil fuels and has not supported a renewable energy system. And this is true despite the fact that this fossil fuel system has created devastating sacrifice zones across this nation in the form of mountaintop removal and here fracking. Well, the US government has known for a very long time that this climate crisis was coming about. And back in 1986, the Senate Committee on Public Works and the Environment wrote a letter to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And in that letter, they acknowledged that there's a possibility that we are destroying the earth and its capability to perform basic life functions. And Congress asked the EPA, or that committee asked the EPA, to actually create a plan to return our atmosphere to stability at 350 parts per million. And guess what? EPA did create a plan, but it was never implemented. And why is that? Because for decades, the fossil fuel industry has been contributing to political campaigns of congressional leaders. And so Congress has blocked all of the proactive measures that could have been taken over the last several decades. And at the same time, the industry has created doubt in the minds of Americans as to whether this crisis was occurring. And that's not the subject of my presentation tonight, but please look up a book called Merchants of Doubt. There's a movie after that book as well, and it explains just how this campaign was orchestrated. And now we have a president who is intent on developing $50 trillion worth of shale oil and natural gas and coal. So here we are. We're in sort of this minute glass between two worlds. And it's really no more than a minute glass. It's at this very moment, time is ticking. This is the time when, gosh, you'd really want a leader, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you really want a leader to just sort of say, hey, let's get the best minds on decarbonization. Let's just bring them in a room, any room, this room, and let's get them to work on decarbonizing and drawing down carbon. We don't have such a leader. In fact, back in the Obama days, the science advisor to the president said, the current situation of the world in relation to the climate problem is that we're in a car with bad brakes driving towards a cliff in the fog. And that was pretty much true of the Obama administration, I would have to say. President Obama missed an epic, historic opportunity. Now, of course, the president is pushing his foot down on the accelerator. President Obama did that too, till the last year in office. He developed a whole lot of fossil fuel reserves. Now, we don't have a leader to bring this out of our mess, but we do have the capacity to create a vision. We do have the capacity to look at what natural law requires. So what does it require? The Earth system, that's beautiful music. It's not from my PowerPoint. The Earth system, scientists say, needs to be returned to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. How many of you have heard that number? Everybody. That's great. So this is like a cholesterol reading. This is a good cholesterol reading for the planet. The problem is we are now over 400 parts per million. So we need to do two things. And I'll bet you've heard of the first, and I'll bet you haven't heard of the second. The first is decarbonization. We need to slash our fossil fuel emissions as rapidly as possible, reaching zero by 2050. The second, which you probably haven't heard of, is drawdown. How many people have heard of that? Well, that's impressive. And here, we're in Boulder, Colorado, so I would assume many of you. But many haven't. And drawdown means you have to have projects around the globe to actually sequester and draw down that carbon, this excess carbon in the atmosphere, to get it down to 350, because we're at 400 now. And without that drawdown, we still go into runaway heating. Do you understand this? We need both to have a stable climate system. One or the other won't work on its own. So our legal strategy must develop around that. Well, let's deal with decarbonization first. Decarbonization means we basically have to create a fossil-free society. And many, many good minds are working on this right now. It requires system change, not change around the edges. Has this kind of technology development happened before? Of course it has. But it hasn't now because the policymakers say, this is a political problem mainly. Here in Colorado, we have some of the best minds at work on alternative energy with the Rocky Mountain Institute. There's many other minds at work too. In the end, renewable energy is so much more efficient, free, safe, healthy, that you can look at this matter as we're pushing a boulder up a mountain. It's going to be pushed a lot faster if we all get behind it. But once it reaches the top of that mountain, that renewable energy boulder, what happens? It goes on its own. It accelerates because it makes so much sense. So that is a really hopeful part of all this. It's going to accelerate fast. Now, we're still facing a time frame. And James Hansen, when he was actually chief climate scientist at NASA, developed a prescription for the planet saying this is how fast we should reduce carbon dioxide to achieve 350 parts per million and avoid tipping points. He said, we have to slash worldwide carbon dioxide emissions annually at 7% if we start in 2015. Here's the catch. The earlier we could have started, the less we would have had to do. So if we had started in 2005, well after that one report I mentioned to you, we would have had only to reduce 3.5%. Now hold on to your seats, because this is why I'm going to tell you the next 3 years are the most important years on the planet. If we wait until 2020, this number would escalate exponentially to 15% a year. That's not feasible. Do you get it? So another way of looking at this is to refer to a letter, a plea written by some of the top climate scientists in the world just a couple months ago. And Christine Figueres, the former UN chief climate chief, was the person who delivered this letter to the world, basically. And they said, we have 3 years not to decarbonize, but to bring down the curve, to start pushing that curve downward. We can no longer increase our carbon emissions. We have to level off at 220 and bring it down. And so they've created this group, Mission 2020. And as they point out, it's necessary, it's desirable, and it's achievable. But it's not being done. It's not being done because the law isn't there. And the policy is, the politics are keeping it back. Now, before we move to the law, let me point out that this is a matter of carbon math. You don't go to nature and say, oh, nature, please, please, let me have a few more years. It doesn't work that way. Imagine this rescue team, and they're trying to rescue someone 150 feet down in a big, deep canyon. Maybe you're the person 150 feet down, this person right here. And boy, you've got a lot of rescuers after you, and they've got a rope, but it only reaches 100 feet. Is that going to help you? No. A rescue rope that is too short is no good at all. Doesn't matter how hard they try or how hard we try. This is carbon math. And so we've got to align our legal system with climate carbon math. Well, our statutory approaches, there's a lot that could be said about them. There's no time to work. They're the deep canyons of the law. They won't work in time. There's no statutory approach that has a remedy geared towards this. And so atmospheric trust litigation was launched by the organization Our Children's Trust in 2011. I'm not with that organization, but it is based in Eugene, Oregon. And it was a campaign to apply the public trust doctrine that I told you about before to this climate crisis. And they brought petitions and or lawsuits in every state in this country and in some countries throughout the world, and those are growing. And basically, they say the same thing in every single petition and lawsuit. They're all brought on behalf of youth who are the beneficiaries of this trust. They are brought against government as trustees of the atmosphere. They say the atmosphere is held in trust, And the trustees, as managers of the atmosphere, those legislators and executive agencies, have the duty to prevent the substantial impairment of the climate system. So everyone seeks from the court a plan, an enforceable plan to carry out the scientific prescription to bring us back to climate stability. Now, the early cases, many of them were dismissed on procedural grounds. The courts basically said, don't look to us for relief. This is a matter that Congress or the state legislatures should be doing. Well, of course it is. That wasn't the point. The point is that they weren't doing it, right? But the courts would dismiss these lawsuits based on preemption, standing, political question doctrines. And Douglas Kaiser, a Yale law professor, wrote an article where he analyzed these cases and other climate cases brought in tort. And he basically said that these early cases represented judicial nihilism, denying their own expansive power. These courts cowered before a catastrophe, he said. But then the tide started turning as the seas began to rise and as the climate science became more blunt. And these cases started turning, awarding victories to the youth plaintiffs. And at the crux of all these cases that are winning is a notion that the courts do have a role, that they are the third branch in our constitutional system of government, and they alone enforce fundamental rights. And so as these cases started winning, Douglas Kaiser summarizes them and talks about them as the jurisdictional struggles that define the boundary between legal order and catastrophic overturning. Well, one of these cases, I'll just describe a few of them, is from Washington, brought by these young plaintiffs against the Washington Department of Ecology for failing to take sufficient action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And the judge just came right out and said that global warming threatens the survival of these youth. Just came right out, said it. And then she found that the air and atmosphere is held in public trust and that there's a constitutional right to climate protection. In Massachusetts, the youth here secured a big victory. The two people on the end are lawyers, where the Supreme Court said this state is not doing enough to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. In Colorado, brought by some plaintiffs that are here, residents of Boulder, young people pictured here in the middle, the two attorneys are on either end, brought a youth petition against the Oil and Gas Commission challenging their fracking rule on a statutory basis. This one was statutory and said, you're not protecting public health and the environment as you statutorily are supposed to. The trial court upheld the denial and said that there were no grounds for this petition, but they got a big victory in the Court of Appeals recently. That court reversed, held in favor of the youth, and now the commission has filed a petition for cert, wanting it to be heard by the Supreme Court of Colorado. And so this case is tremendously important to the future of this state, which is being fracked all over. And one of the lead plaintiffs is this young man, a 17-year-old, Chetesket Martinez, and his brother is also a plaintiff. His mother might be here. Is his mother here? Tamara? No, didn't make it tonight. But anyway, Chetesket is becoming a leading figure. He's right here from Boulder, Colorado. You are his community. And this young man has been 3 times to the United Nations to testify on climate. He is the youth organizer for the worldwide group Earth Guardians. He's a hip-hop artist and releasing his first album. And he's also released a book called We Rise. He rocks. And he rocks Boulder, but he rocks the planet as well. So watch him and his brother, Chetesket Martinez, and the other plaintiffs. In other countries, there have been victories. In the Netherlands, finding that the Netherlands government didn't do enough. In Pakistan, same thing. These were constitutional findings. And in Oregon, where I come from, Eugene, Oregon, what is called the biggest case on the planet was filed in 2015 on behalf of youth. And these youth challenge the federal government for acting with deliberate indifference to the peril they knowingly created over decades of fossil fuel policy. These are the 2 lead plaintiffs. Notice your Boulder, Colorado plaintiff is one of the 2 lead plaintiffs in this lawsuit. It was brought on behalf of 21 youth across the country against multiple federal agencies, every agency having a direct role in fossil fuel policy. And soon after it was brought, the entire fossil fuel industry intervened through trade associations. So these young plaintiffs were facing American Petroleum Institute and all of these major trade associations. It challenges not one or two aspects of fossil fuel policy, because that really won't do the job in time. It challenges the entire fossil fuel policy of the United States of America, from extraction and development and permitting and export subsidies, the whole thing. The challenge is premised on constitutional rights, not statutory rights. It asserts a constitutional duty under the federal public trust doctrine, as well as the due process clause of the U.S. Constitution. And it requests the court to order a plan, enforceable plan, for decarbonization and drawdown. There were 2 hearings on the matter. They were packed with children in the courtroom. The Judge Ake, in the second hearing, let all the children go in before any adult could make it in. And I had a tough time getting in that one. And because I wasn't under the age of 16. And 2 days after the election of President Trump, the court issued a 52-page opinion holding that the children had a constitutional right to a stable climate system. So this is what she said. And I think future generations will look back on this and say, well, of course. But she said, I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. She recognized this is no ordinary lawsuit. She knows this is not a lawsuit. Judge Aiken knows this is not a lawsuit based on any sort of statute. And so she found a constitutional due process right and said that embraced the public trust. It constitutionalizes the public trust. And this is a long quote, but she basically said the public trust arises from attributes of sovereignty, cannot be legislated away. So after President Trump took office in January, he became the lead defendant. These are some of the plaintiffs. The attorneys immediately started in on discovery, which is a process of getting facts. They even issued a notice of deposition against Rex Tillerson while he was still, not yet Secretary of State, but while he was still CEO of Exxon. And so that's been held in abeyance because he's Secretary of State. And this discovery is working towards what people are calling the trial of the Millennium. Because it's the first time, if you think about it, that U.S. fossil fuel policy meets climate science in court. And it's a different matter spewing climate misinformation outside of court. Courts are rigorous bodies. They're fact-finding bodies. In June, the industry made a surprising, in fact, stunning move. They, as the lead counsel for the children put, they're running for the hills. They made en masse motions to withdraw. Perhaps because they were faced with discovery requests and admissions that would have been very difficult to answer. Perhaps, we don't know. But there is now a motion for appeal filed by the Trump administration. This is technically difficult to explain, so I won't. But right now, we're waiting for a decision from a Ninth Circuit motions panel as to whether or not this case goes on a premature appeal. If not, it will go to trial, and the trial will be held in February. At the same time, more cases are being filed as fast as possible in other states in this country, in other countries across the world. And the children are hoping, and many are hoping, that with a few good opinions solidifying that the green dominoes will start to fall and that these enforceable plans will get underway in time to force decarbonization. One of the leading climate scientists in the world looks at this litigation and says, judicial relief may be the best, the last, and at this late stage, the only real chance to preserve a habitable planet for young people and future generations. So we've talked about decarbonization. We always have to keep the big picture in mind. I want to just spend a couple minutes, not much, on another strategy for decarbonization, and that is actions to suppress fossil fuel extraction and transport. And there's many actions that could happen. The Colorado fracking resistance is one. But let me talk about my region. My region is probably the only region in the country that is not a fossil fuel region. And partly because of that, we have developed a solidarity against fossil fuel projects that seek approvals to be placed along our coastlines. So if you look at this little map, you see a whole lot of fossil fuel reserves in the coal fields of Powder River Basin, the Bakken oil fields, the tar sands oil. There's a whole lot of fossil fuels in the interior of America. You see that up there? Okay. Now imagine all those Asian markets. And these fossil fuel entrepreneurs want access to the Asian markets. The most direct route goes through where? My region, the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, and Washington. And there is now a huge growing movement. There were 12, over a dozen actually, ports and pipelines proposed in our region to get this fossil fuel over to Asian markets. And resistance grew in tribal and non-tribal communities and is summed up by the None Shall Pass movement. It's comprehensive coal, oil, and natural gas. And it's been so successful so far that the Sightline Institute has said, this is where projects go to die. I want to say this has a huge tribal component, Charles, because the tribes have limited jurisdiction only on their reservations, but they are extending their environmental sovereignty off the reservations. They are the heart and soul of this movement in many ways, and they are stopping projects all across this region. How? Because they have treaty fishing rights at every waterway. Every major waterway has treaty fishing rights. And those are property rights which are the oldest in the region. And so there have been, and I would love to spend another several minutes talking about this, too detailed for you, but there have been multiple permit denials on the local, state, and federal level, even in the Obama administration, based on protecting tribal treaty rights and the trust obligation. And so this is a huge movement. The Pacific Northwest, people who are in resistance of fossil fuels, they intend to put a legal chokehold on the transportation between the interior and those Asian markets. So that's not to replace atmospheric trust litigation, but it's another showing of how treaty rights and also the public trust can be used. Now the other side of the picture, which I'm going to start winding down here, is drawdown. Drawdown is what many of you have heard about, but some of you haven't. We need to actually scrub out 150 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If we don't do this, we still go into runaway heating. The good news is this doesn't have a ticking time clock as much as the decarbonization. And the other good news is nature has processes to do this, at least for 100 gigatons worth. So if we want to move from the burning like there's no tomorrow to actually a tomorrow, we have to design atmospheric recovery. And it'd be really nice if a world leader would just simply create an atmospheric recovery plan, like a cleanup plan for the atmosphere. That's what I'm asking for. What would that entail? And the scientists are rearing to go in all these categories. It would entail 4, at least, categories of projects around the world: reforestation, mangrove and wetland restoration, regenerative agriculture using different methods to grow crops, and regenerative grazing. All of these methods can literally draw down carbon from the atmosphere. And they're also great because they restore natural ecosystems. They boost food supplies. They create local jobs. Any state legislator should love this concept. Any state legislator. Bring jobs to all these communities by restoring the Earth's natural ability to draw down carbon. So what's in the way? Can you guess? Money. Money. Because they need money to start these projects, to get them rolling. The scientists are rearing to go. And so the other part of the legal strategy, which has not been launched yet, but I'm in an outreach mode right now trying to get the idea across to change agents that can take this forward. The idea is to bring natural resource damage actions by co-trustees of the atmosphere. Those would be states, tribes, federal government, not federal government, this government, but national governments elsewhere, against the carbon majors to fund drawdown. So again, 3 categories of trustees could bring these lawsuits and are situated to do so. One would be the state attorneys general, or a subset, tribes could, and foreign nations. The logic of this is really no more complicated than the logic of cleaning up after the BP oil spill. After any oil spill in the water, the federal government goes after, and some states and tribes do too, goes after the corporation to get money for restoration, for cleanup and also restoration. A few years ago, about 7 years ago, I believe, Rick Heed, who is from Colorado, and co-authors released a groundbreaking study. They had done research on the emissions and market shares of all the major fossil fuel corporations, and they can attribute now percentage emissions into the atmosphere of carbon dioxide to individual corporations. And so now with this study, again, it comes from one of your fellow Coloradoans, with this study, all eyes are turning now to the fossil fuel companies, and so many local jurisdictions are now wanting to sue fossil fuel companies for damage because their responsible shares are now subject to this analysis. And so recently, California counties sued fossil fuel companies for damage from rising sea levels. Today, and my research assistant got this to me just in time for me to put this in this presentation tonight, San Francisco and Oakland sued major oil companies for damage over rising seas. So what's the problem? They're literally paving the way for natural resource damage lawsuits. Do you see? They're suing the fossil fuel companies for damages. What's the problem? Any of you know? It's always money. There's not enough money in the world to pay for all the damage unleashed on this planet by the fossil fuel industry. There's not enough money in the world. So here's the categories of damage that people are going to look to the fossil fuel companies to be responsible for. Loss of life and property, economic losses, relocation expenses, infrastructure damage. That's the focus of these California suits. And then secondary natural resource damages like lost wildlife and forests. But if we don't get an atmospheric recovery plan funded first, all these other damages just get bigger and bigger and bigger because the problem is never solved until you stabilize the atmosphere. Does everybody see that? So this has to have priority to all the counties and states suing. I'm going to wrap up now, having given the big climate picture and shown how the law can work. And so let me cap this evening's remarks by just noting that we find ourselves faced with an immediate need to mount a massive, urgent defense effort beyond the scale of World War II to secure the life on Earth for all generations to come. And this is all hands-on-deck time. The closest analogy I can make to our situation is this. It's as if humanity has jumped from an airplane 30,000 feet off the ground and is in free fall towards the Earth. And humanity has a parachute. You see it right there. It's got to open it. It's got the tools to open it, but it has to open it, and it has to open it, if any of you have parachuted before, within about 500 feet of the ground. Now, if it opens it after that point, say 200 feet, doesn't matter. That's when that tipping point has been passed. It's got to open it before 500 feet of the ground, or we're doomed. The good news is that we all hold a ripcord in this big parachute. But for it to fully deploy, we all have to pull our ripcords now. So confronted with climate reality, we all face three choices. We can slip into denial, or just as bad, in my mind, distraction, clinging to our business as usual, living today as we did yesterday, with no particular regard for the climate emergency. Or we might find too much terror in our reality and succumb to paralysis. That too leads to inaction. It's really no better. Or we can confront this crisis with courage and determination and focus and find our way into it using our talents and resources to make an essential contribution. Sometimes it seems that the whole world rests on our shoulders. But that's not true. Accept the fact that you cannot save the world by yourself. But at the same time, the world cannot be saved without you. It's going to take everybody, and people are rising to this crisis all around and creating power from their complete solidarity. Whatever your position is in life, this is the time to do something, do anything, just don't do nothing. Teachers, bring global warming to the classroom. Parents, bring it to the PTA. Lawyers, bring it to the courtroom. Bankers, bring it to the corporations. But everyone, please keep your focus. And you know the big picture after tonight. Keep your focus. Yes, it is a focus blurred with tears of grief for the priceless nature that will inevitably be lost as we mourn for those illimitable mountains that weep their glaciers into the sea. But let our focus be clarified and emboldened by our purpose and our knowledge, the profoundly spiritual knowledge, in fact, that we are the only generation on Earth that can act in time. We are only one link in this very long chain of humanity on this planet. But whether we are 17 years old or 97 years old, we somehow find that fate has delivered all of us together in this one room, into living on Earth at this pivotal moment in time. We did not live 100 years ago before society ever could have imagined this crisis. And we will not be here 100 years from now, a century too late. We can only claim our moment. As Terry Tempest Williams says, the eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. So let us leave this evening knowing that we hold together not the power of life, but the trust of life, and let us embrace and carry out that sacred covenant that runs through all of time. Thank you.
Well, before you all go out and get to work on this, let's head over to this next room and enjoy some food and drink together and continue our conversation. Thank you all for being here.
What else can you say at a moment like this?